All right, welcome back, everybody, to a very special thing, a conversation. A writer has agreed to talk to me, and it's Lavie Tidhar, as far as I know, that's how to pronounce it. And I'm really happy to have you here. So, welcome to this very small channel where people talk about weird stuff.
Thank you. Actually, that was how to pronounce it. That's pretty much a first for me.
I have friends in Israel, and I have, well, my sister lived there until like last month, so I knew how to ask whom to ask.
Yeah, no one ever asks.
Well,
They just take a shot at it.
one of my viewers whom I met when I was in Haifa last time round, at some point was like, everyone is pronouncing him wrong. This is how you do it. So I had help, is my point. Anyway, welcome to this conversation. I'm incredibly happy that you said yes. And since it's past noon here, I am going to have a beer. So cheers.
Yes.
All right. So my thought is we'll start talking. Well, I mean, we'll start by you introducing yourself because you're a man of many different things. And then I thought we'll start with your recent book, Six Lives, that came out 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. And then we kind of go back through all the things you've done over the years and see if there's any way to make sense of like how you ended up where you are at the moment. That's sort of like roughly what I thought. And then we can, probably get sidetracked at some point very early on. So if people have never heard of you and if they end up on my channel, I wonder why that would be the case. But like, how would you describe yourself beyond saying that you're a serious writer of very serious things?
I hate introducing myself. It's one of the most awkward things.
Yeah, no.
My sense is always I've failed at everything I've tried. I did science fiction and I did children's books and I did comics and, it's a series of unfortunate events the way I look at it. Um, so yeah, no, I do enjoy it because I'm doing different things. People know me for different things. So, I was just talking to the Scottish parliamentary group for some reason,
Okay.
about Adama, which is one of my serious literary novels, and they were like, yeah. And then he goes, and then someone told me you actually write science fiction. I said, yes, we try not to advertise that for the serious readers. But then I found out that obviously no one actually reads, um, literary fiction. So I should have stuck with the science fiction and fantasy, I think. But then, yeah.
So mostly you write stuff and do stuff around writing, I guess is the best way to describe it. And yeah, I read that last year and I really enjoyed it. We'll get to that. Your latest book was Six Lives, which is a crime novel sort of in parts and a general connection of like several stories. And how did you end up in serious fiction, I guess, is something that I'm interested in because obviously I have seen authors go the opposite route of starting out doing literary fiction and ending up in genre fiction. Someone like Michael Chabon, for example, went that route, I feel. And how did you end up doing the opposite journey? And what did you what kind of got you to start writing Six Lives after the stuff that you've done recently with both Maror and Adama? Was there like a point where you said like, nah, I'm gonna go to like a different part of the world. I want to talk about something else than just Israel at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely a factor. Yeah, it's weird. I mean, I dabbled in crime fiction. For a long time, I felt, I'm not sure I can take science fiction and fantasy any further than I have, and
Mm,
I did quite well. I do quite well in science fiction and fantasy, but I didn't feel I could take it any further. And so it was a question of, can I do something else? And I
mm,
really wanted to write Maror, but I also thought that was a very difficult book to do, and it would require a lot of research, and it would
mm.
require a big leap of faith to try and write something like that.
Yeah.
And the reason I managed to do it was because I have this very supportive publisher in the UK, Head of Zeus. And when I met with them for the first time, my publisher basically said, why don't you just go and write the book you want to write and we'll publish it? And I've never heard a publisher say that. That's not something publishers ever say. Why don't you just go and write the book you want to write? So I had that backing, I had that support that I knew I could write it and they would actually put it out. And that was a huge sort of boost. So I got to go and write more raw. And, my biggest fear about trying to write, mainstream fiction, I guess, whatever you want to call it, is that I wasn't sure I could do books that didn't have the sort of the elves and the aliens in it, as it were. And it turns out you just take out the elves and the aliens. It's not that hard.
Yeah, and I think that's
So
interesting because like some one thing I've noticed, like I've gone back and reread some of the older books like from your catalog all the way back from like Osama, which was the first one that I read when it came out. That's like when I kind of got to know your work. And you've always used a lot of like of the stylistic trappings of crime fiction or detective fiction, hard-boiled, some, thriller, spy thriller stuff. It's always been part of your vocabulary. It just had like, spaceships or aliens or elves in it in a lot of ways. Like so it kind of felt natural to see that without the aliens and elves, I guess.
yeah, I mean, to be honest, I never really wrote about aliens. It's one of the things that I can't seem to do. So
Yeah.
ideally, I'm going to go off and run a giant space opera with nothing but aliens in it. So that's the plan. But yeah, it's weird because I always describe it, growing up in the library, as it were, and they had this little corner in the library, and
Mm.
one bookcase was the science fiction, and the other bookcase was crime.
Yeah.
And I always considered myself a science fiction reader, but I guess the crime sort of filtered in without me noticing.
Yeah, that,
Uh,
that makes sense. I mean, I was like recently I read Cahokia Jazz, which came out last year, and I enjoyed that. And then I went back and reread Yiddish Policeman's Union, and then I went and reread in this case Unholy Land. It's like, why do all these alternate history books always choose like the hard-boiled crime fiction as their mode? Is there like something that makes crime fiction sort of like an easy mode to tell these other stories because we kind of all know the vocabulary already, or is that like yeah, I don't know.
I don't think all the alternate histories use it, but I think the reason I like to use it definitely is because it's very loose.
Hmm,
It's it's a very loose structure that is basically about asking questions,
yeah,
Ideally, you just have someone going around the world asking questions and they go into everywhere. That's kind of the whole purpose of the detective story.
yeah,
So it's a very easy mode to use, and I used it in A Man Lies Dreaming. I used it in Unholy Land because it's just someone going around asking questions. And I mean, I have told this story before, but I made a mistake because the detective thing was never the important element, just an excuse for someone to wander around this world and explore it.
yeah,
And so when I wrote, and Unholy Land was a very difficult book to place for obvious reasons.
yeah,
But back in the day, I wrote sort of a proposal for it, a synopsis, and sent it to my then editor. And it's about this guy, and he gets back to his homeland, and he starts looking for his missing niece, and he starts discovering these multiple alternate histories competing, and so on. And I sent her the proposal, and she came back to me. And she said, "That's all very well, Lavie, but what happened to the niece?"
yeah,
And I forgot. I forgot he was looking for the niece because that wasn't really very important to me. But obviously, the demands of the genre require that he actually find the niece at the end. So
yeah,
I had to make sure that when I wrote the book, he actually finds her at the end.
yeah, yeah.
But
I can see that.
that's kind of the motivation for it. It's an
Mm.
excuse to hang a skeleton of plot on something and then just run around.
Yeah, I thought about like maybe it's also that because you have like a guy or like someone, the detective goes around and asks question, which allows you to sort of explain the setting in a way that doesn't come across as your old school 1950s encyclopedia sort of info dump because someone is actually has to ask these kind of questions and we can sort of get to know the world through that kind of character who has to ask and is not just like encounters people that just yell at him for like hours.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
maybe
none of my detectives are particularly good detectives. That's the other thing. They're terrible detectives. I mean, Hitler in A Man Lies Dreaming is a
yeah.
terrible detective.
Well, he
Even
gets
though he
beaten
has
up a
very
lot.
strong. He has very strong opinions about it. Yeah, they always have to be beaten up 3 times in a book. That's like a rule with
Yeah.
hard-boiled detectives. Whereas, noir is a very different sort of genre.
Yeah.
Noir isn't really about detectives, it's about bad people doing bad things. And
Yeah, and I
it
mean noir
doesn't
is more
have
like the stylings of like the movie that kind of got like then dragged into like a literary genre afterwards from like the way I
well,
always encountered it.
no, I think it was a bunch of noir writers in Hollywood, really, who kind
Mm,
of ended up in Hollywood, and most of
yeah.
them were alcoholics, and they never had a very happy life. But it's a completely different genre in a way, and it doesn't have the stylistic trappings of hard boiled. It doesn't have all those games that hard boiled plays with
Yeah.
the language. So I'm interested in both of them, even though it's sort of a distinction that not everyone makes.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but I mean, they're bad detectives. The only time I've really done proper detective stuff is actually my Judge D mysteries, which are vampire
Yeah.
Agatha Christie with vampires, basically. And I never thought I'd be able to do Golden Age mysteries because they're puzzle stories.
Mm,
And that was a great shock to me to discover that I can actually do them and work out these intricate puzzles where it doesn't really matter that anyone died. The corpse
yeah.
does never matters. It's just about the puzzle, and
Yeah.
they're a lot of fun to do. It's a completely different thing. And I played with that in Sex Lives a little bit. That there is a country house murder that is sort of an inversion of Agatha Christie.
Yeah, which obviously has the mention of Agatha Christie, which how important is Agatha Christie as an influence on you? Because you've mentioned her a couple of times in different books.
Well, I mean, it's a running gag, I guess, more than anything.
Mm,
Obviously, my influences in terms of crime are more. Well, I tended to think they were more the hard-boiled school,
mm,
Chandler especially, and
yeah.
so on. But really, Agatha Christie, is such a dominant voice.
Yeah.
And actually finding myself in that space where I can sort of write these sub Agatha Christie murder mysteries, a lot of fun. I just never thought I'd never be capable. And also, there's the famous Raymond Chandler essay about crime, and he very much looks down on that sort of style of the classic golden age puzzles. For him, it was all about using the detective story to explore corruption and socioeconomic
Yeah.
environments. But I think there's actually quite a lot to be said for just fun mysteries, which I only ever did with my little vampire series because
Yeah.
it's so silly and fun. And
But I think that's like the point, right? The puzzle always is, there's a playful nature to that. That kind of goes against the grain of like what you get in like a hard boiled, where there is, corruption stuff. There's always a sort of like a playful sort of aspect to it where you want the reader to kind of figure out the puzzle, possibly ahead of the detective and so forth. And you kind of engage with the reader in a different way when you write that kind of mystery because you're posing a mystery to the reader in a way. Whereas with the hardboiled, you're not necessarily posing a mystery to the reader, but you're speaking to the reader in like a different way, I guess.
well, I mean, I think that was the interesting thing with it because you have to play fair with the readers. You have to allow the
Yeah.
reader to solve the mystery before the detective does. But it was really interesting to see the reviews for some of these stories.
Hmm.
And they say, "Oh, this story is great. I didn't figure it out." Or you get that this story is terrible. I figured it out before the detective.
Yeah.
So the judgment of those stories goes on a different level. It's
Yeah.
whether you were successful or not against a detective. They've been a lot of fun to do. And people actually seem to enjoy it, which is again unusual for me to find anyone who actually enjoys something I do. So
That's an interesting point of bringing up there. Is like, how antagonistic are you as a writer? Do you want people to enjoy your work, or is it more sometimes that you want to, get some other emotion out of a reader?
well, I mean, I always think, I want to get people to laugh and then I want to get people to cry. If I can do both of those things, then I'm
Yeah.
happy. I think A Man Lies Dreaming hopefully does that, or it does it for some people,
It definitely
obviously.
does it for me. I just reread it this morning and I'm like, damn, it's a that's a dark book in a lot of ways.
And very funny though.
Oh, it's incredibly funny.
Because I mean it wouldn't work if it wasn't, because
Yeah.
the if you just have darkness, then it loses its power. I think you have to sort of have the humor in there.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know, but I'm uncomfortable with. I mean, I think I'm a bit indifferent to people's responses. I mean, as long as it satisfies me, I'm sort of happy.
Okay.
Obviously, I'd like to be universally adored, and I think I'm overdue the Booker Prize. But he said bitterly. But no, I can certainly see why people don't like certain books. I can certainly see why people wouldn't like A Man Lies Dreaming necessarily,
Yeah.
or
That's
any
kind of
number
like how
of
I got
books.
to actually started out reading your books was like back in the day when Osama came out and I won the World Fantasy Award or whatever it was, something at the time. And I was like, this sounds really interesting. My flatmate was like, with that title, it's gonna be just provocation for cheap marketing. And he has refused to read the book up to this day. And I at the same time was like, now I'm gonna read it and I'm gonna defend it to you for the rest of my life. And I read it and I really enjoyed it. And I'm like, well, there is something in there.
Well, the joke obviously is that Osama bin Laden's never in the book.
Exactly.
It's just a shadow of Osama bin Laden is on the book. And so I always know people haven't read the book because they say, oh, your book Osama about Osama bin Laden. I'm like, no, he's not in the book.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but I mean, I didn't write that book for anyone specific. I wrote it for myself. And in fact, it was impossible pretty much to find a publisher for it. I mean, the fact that it won the World Fantasy Award and it got to where it did was pretty incredible, but it wasn't anything anyone was expecting, I don't think.
Do you think the fact that
Um,
like the actual like execution of Osama bin Laden happened roughly around the time the book had published, so you kind of got like bonus press there?
It was no, I mean it was a difficult question because a part of me was like, please don't find him. Not yet.
Yeah, I mean
And
the
then
book ends with the Tora Bora battle, and it's like when he escapes yet again, and then and that's like the last like part that we see of the writings of Mike Lang, and then you
I
yeah, and
didn't
then
I actually ended up writing a sort of coda called The
mhm.
Last Son, which was after he was caught. But it doesn't really matter, the book's not about him.
No, exactly.
Um, so it doesn't really matter. I don't know. In terms of the publishing, it was only published by a small press initially.
Yeah,
So it wasn't, there were hardly any commercial considerations because,
yeah.
no one was going to ever see this book. It was going to be out in like a tiny, tiny edition,
Mm.
and that would have been it. So I was very surprised with everything that happened with them. There's occasional books where you read them and you have no expectations from them.
Yeah.
Central Station, that's another book that I had zero expectations from. I was going to self-publish it at some point because I just thought no one would ever publish this book. Um,
Because no
and
one
if
does
they
slice
did
of life
publish it,
science
no
fiction
one.
anymore.
Yeah, because it's I always say it's a science fiction book where nothing happens, which is the very you know the
Yeah.
antithesis of science fiction, of American science fiction anyway. So I wasn't expecting anything from it, and that turned out to be probably one of my most successful books.
Mm.
But that was just a bonus.
Yeah.
Honestly, I was surprised, and occasionally I'll see reviews that say I didn't like this book. It's nothing happens, and I'd
Yeah.
be like, I know, I know.
How
That's
often are you
wrong.
surprised by the fact that like a publisher does actually publish a book of yours?
Every time, every time.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I've been lucky that, I've had supportive editors over the years, but the problem is even if you find a supportive editor, they might not be able to sell you in to the publisher,
Mm.
so they'd be enthusiastic about a book and then they'd go to the meeting and the salespeople would say, we can't touch this. So I've been very lucky, and I think occasionally I will find editors who believe in what I do quite strongly, and that kind of gets me through. But it's definitely not getting any easier out there.
Yeah, I can imagine that. But like when you look back at like a lot of the books, like Osama sounds like a one of those concepts that can be hard to sell, and A Man Lies Dreaming certainly doesn't sound like a concept that was easy to sell to any publisher at that point.
Oh
And
my God, who would have published A Man Lies Dreaming? I'd have my agent thought it was hilarious because he'd be like, "Well, what's your book about?" Well, it's about Adolf Hitler and he's a private eye, you know.
yeah,
and you just get these shocked reactions or people laughing in your face, sort of thing. And I think the secret is to somehow make that work. I think is the real
Yeah.
secret. But I got lucky with publishing that one. Yeah.
Yeah. I can imagine.
And then I got lucky with the way, it kept going, which has been really nice. Um,
Mhm.
yeah.
So what
But
originally
I
started?
write books. I
Yeah.
mean, I write books that are sort of antagonistic because they take on topics that I hate, essentially. So I wrote a superhero novel because I hate superheroes. I wrote an Arthurian novel because I hate Arthurian novels. I mean, they are dumb. There's no point in doing this stuff. So
Yeah.
who am I appealing to here? Because the people who like, say, Arthurian novels are not going to like my Arthurian novel.
I
And
really
the people who
enjoyed it.
like superheroes aren't gonna like my superhero thing. So I'm kind of like it's self defeat. It's a self defeating policy, but I can't help myself. I kind of pick topics that really annoy me, basically.
So anger is one of your motivators when it comes to writing books.
Yeah.
It's understandable. Speaking of the Arthurian novel and the Hood, you said you called it the antimatter of Britain. Is there a plan to return to that, or are you done with that and have moved on to like the next big thing that annoys you?
Yeah, there's a plan. You know, I mean, I never intended to do it. I just intended to write by force alone. And then
Yeah,
I had a chat with a publisher, and they were like, so what comes after that? And I was sort of like, well, if you did King Arthur, theoretically you could do Robin Hood.
yeah,
And then if you do that, so it kind of it got pretzeled into being. Yeah, there's a plan for two more books if I can ever figure out how to do them and find
yeah.
time. But also, no one actually read The Hood, I don't think. It's
I read it. I really enjoyed the Heart of Darkness pastiche with Guy of Gisborne. I was like, wow, this is really clever.
I enjoyed all of it, but it was one of those books that I really had no control over it, or at least I thought I was going to be writing by force alone too, essentially.
Hmm.
And if you read the opening sequence, it reads like by force alone,
Yeah,
um, and then it goes off the rails, and I can pinpoint the exact place. It's like a third of the way in when the book really goes off the rails. And I was sort of trying to control it up to that point. And I just thought this book doesn't want to be by force alone. I've already written by force alone. It wants to be this its own weird thing, and I just have to go with it.
mm,
So I went along with it, and I have to admit, I had a lot of fun with it. But it came out this book and The Escapement, which are two of my weirdest books, they both came out during the pandemic and
yeah.
sort of didn't really get. And also, they are so weird that if people don't get that, they're
That's an
not going to
interesting
get
point,
it.
though, that you bring up that you tried to write by force alone too, and then it kind of got off the rails and didn't want to be that. It was like, how much control do you as a writer sort of like try to exert on your narratives, and how often do you go like, well, I have this great idea, I'll start with it, and then I'll see where it takes me. I guess it kind of depends on the kind of story you're writing.
Yeah, but usually I have control over what I'm doing.
Yeah, sure.
I think the thing with The Hood is it's a different type of book, and I think I
Mm,
was trying to force it into something like. But there was no point writing another by force alone, as fun as by force alone is.
yeah.
You have to do something new with every book, or you're wasting your time. And so as soon as I gave in to what the book really wanted to be, basically as soon as I got rid of this consideration of what people might want and just focus on what the book needs,
Yeah.
the book was fun, and it's so much fun. It's one of my favorite books in terms of just how silly some of it is. I think I wrote in a play at the end, towards the end, there's a very short section
Yeah.
written as a play. And the reason is everyone hates a play in a book. I hate them. I hate, if someone sticks a play in the middle of a book, I'm going to skip it because it's so annoying. So I designed it that it was very short
Mm.
and you can skip it and it doesn't affect the book at all. but
Yeah.
but I saw at least one review where someone said, I persevered with this book up to the play and then I just gave up. I was like, that was a step too far for me. But I really I
I
thought it
love
was funny, which which is my main
Yeah.
motivation. Is usually if I think it's funny, it's going to go in.
Yeah,
And I
I
thought
love
that
the
was
part when you
hilarious.
did like the fight sequence as this I don't even know the English word for that, like the when you basically have like the picture book and you just like flip it over really fast and you can see the movement and like I know what you're doing there, but you're writing it about a codex and then imagine the big codex and then flipping the pages fast. Like,
Oh
damn.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember that.
The,
No,
the
my
moment where I go
favorite.
like you bastard and I mean it in like as a compliment. I'm like that's
I
yeah.
think my favorite bit in the hood comes immediately after the play when you're really getting lost, and then you have a section called the narrator, which is almost the end of the book,
Yeah.
and some guy shows because I'm very interested in narrators as well,
Yeah.
in narration. And so this guy shows up and he goes, "Oh, let me, I'm actually the narrator of the book. Let
Explain.
me let me explain what's going on." And then you gradually realize he hasn't got a clue. It was such a fun, and he's like, I'm not like my colleagues who are all writing these really popular dragon books about King Arthur. I'm gonna be like edgy and go and write about Robin Hood. It was, I enjoyed that a lot, but I can see where I'm gonna lose people along the way, and
Yeah.
I can live with that.
Yeah, I can imagine that coming up. So, like another thing that I found interesting is well, like going back to a lot of your books, like a lot of your books are relatively short, and the long ones are usually sort of split up into sort of like individual, like shorter narratives, kind of episodes and stuff. What do you think is the like perfect length for a story for you?
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with novels, or what I discovered was that I can make very long novels out of short bits.
Yeah.
I love writing novellas.
Hmm.
I wish I could write more novellas, but novellas are just the hardest length of story to really sell on their own, as much as I love them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but anywhere between sort of like tenth, well, it depends. If you look at By Force Alone or Maraud, they can move between 7,000, 20,000 words in that range. But putting them together allows me to tell really, really long stories that I wouldn't be able to tell otherwise.
Mm.
And also, you kind of straying into the saga territory where you can cover a lot more time, a lot more space. You can cover a diverse cast of characters. And
Yeah.
I think it gives you a lot of tools that you wouldn't necessarily have otherwise.
Yeah. That makes sense. I was just like a lot of like the actual like narrative arcs are usually relatively short, and then you go back and it's like, yeah, it all fits together, but it could have been like serialized at that point.
Yeah, but they have to add up to something more than the individual parts. I think that's what it comes down to.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely.
So even with Six Lives, which is essentially
Yeah,
six novellas, the overall effect should be stronger than the individual parts. The individual parts shouldn't work unless they're part of the larger mosaic
yeah, that makes
he
sense. Do you
said.
think that's part of
Yeah.
like your um experience like growing up reading a lot of science fiction? Because a lot of science fiction you have like a lot of like short stories and that got like serialized and then turned into like mosaic novels and stuff like that. Do you think that's sort of like one of the ways that science fiction reading science fiction kind of influenced your writing and storytelling that you're sort of in these like shorter narrative like forms?
I mean, maybe. I think it's more of a natural, everyone has a natural length that they're better at.
Yeah.
But I think some of the best science fiction was those mosaics, Lord of Light, City, all those great novels.
Yeah.
Or, Circus World, which is one of my favorite books that no one's read.
Yeah.
Um, they work perfectly, but also what I really, really miss as a reader and as a writer is short books. Because if you think about the way books used to be,
Yeah.
especially, popular books would be sold in kiosks and they were tiny little paperbacks that you could pick up and read in, a few hours.
Yeah.
And since the 80s, books have been becoming, bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And a lot of it is simply to do with shelf space, that you want to dominate the space on a shelf in a bookshop.
Yeah.
And I really miss. And one of the great things for me was that I had a publisher like Tachyon in the States, allowing me specifically to write these shorter form books.
Yeah.
Whereas my UK publisher out of Zeus, they really love the big books. They're like the bigger the better, you know. So
Yeah.
I had to kind of find a hack as to how you do these incredibly long books. But that becomes addictive in its own right with a book like Maror, which is huge,
Yeah.
is you get to tell this huge epic story that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise.
I mean, it does have like all this. I mean, when you look at like the central station universe in a whole, right? You have written a lot of short stories that kind of span that whole like universe. You could probably just like collect a lot of them and put them into like one big book and sell that at like one collection or something, I guess.
Well, that would be pretty huge. I think they're like 200,000 words now,
Wow.
just on the short stories, maybe.
Could be.
Um, so there's like Central Station, there's Neon, there's another one that I hope will get published called Martian Pastoral, and then
Okay.
there's about 40 short stories. So yeah, it's a big, it's a fun thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone takes it particularly seriously, but I enjoy them. I'd like to keep doing one every now and then, like a Central Station Universe book. Because there's so many corners of that world and there's so many things you can do with it still.
True. So how much planning did you actually put into that world? But you know, there's like science fiction authors or like fantasy authors that like spend like years and years doing incredibly detailed world building, and there's others who just like go like, well, it's a whole wild world. I'll just like write something and then state it's also in this universe, and we'll see what happens. Like, do you actually plan it in advance, like how that world works, or is it more like whatever kind of feels like it could belong there, kind of gets pushed into that sort of world?
No, it's just made up as I go along. I mean, I think the rule is if you make a reference to something, then that's something then becomes a part of the universe. And occasionally, a lot of these references over the years, they're
Mm,
to existing stories. So it's what Cordwainer Smith used to do basically. You get all these references, and occasionally you'll actually have a story exploring some of those, references.
yeah,
So it becomes its own sort of mythology of the future. So as long
that's
as I can find something new and interesting to do with it, I will. Occasionally I get to periods where I'm like, I've got nothing left to say here. Um, I think after I wrote Central Station, or after Central Station was published, or after I finished writing, I can't, it took me like more than 2 years before I wrote another Central Station story. I just
mm,
didn't have anything left to say that was interesting. Um,
mm,
and occasionally I'll try and explore a corner of that world, like the Neo-Neanderthal cyberpunk stories or the Titan stories. And then I'll run out of, again, I'll do a few and I'll have nothing to add and uh, and move on. So I was quite happy recently because I wrote a whole Martian cycle, and I was quite pleased that I didn't
okay.
run out of steam. I actually had kept having things to do with it.
That's pretty cool. Um, like last year you published two books. You published both, at least two books. You published both like Adama for like the serious literary crowd, and you published The Circumference of the World, which kind of went back and took your old Lodestar stories. Like, how did it happen that you have like two books like in like the span of like I don't know a month or so coming out? Was that accident or was that planned? It's like, hey, I'm still doing both science fiction and serious books.
No, the circumference. Well, I am doing both, or I will keep doing both if I can, because I enjoy doing both. But I mean, the circumference of the world took years and years and years to get out. It's got a long, convoluted history and numerous rewrites, and yeah, so that kind of worked out accidentally. It was finally in a shape that everyone was more or less happy with, and it came out. So it is a much older book in terms of
Hmm.
the sort of stuff I do. And I think the stuff I was doing, which was, if you think about the four books that were like Osama, The Violent Century, and Man Lies Dreaming, and then Unholy Land is sort of a coda to that. It was sort of like this noir alternate history political books.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, I'm done with that. I've done it. I sort of did Unholy Land as a coda to that. So it kind of leans into all of that
Kind of
the
makes
Dhamma.
sense because, like in A Man Lies Dreaming, you already mentioned the whole Uganda West, apart at the end, near the end, about like the different ways or different places where a Jewish homeland could be built. So you kind of prefigure that in.
Well, that actually comes from a story I did for a collection called Hebrew Punk many, many years ago. I
I
wrote
never
a
read that,
story
but I
called
gave it as a
Uganda.
present to my sister when she moved to Haifa, and I'm like, hey, here's something you might want to read.
Well, that's a really early collection. I mean, that's
Yeah.
from 2007, I think. And one of the weird things is there's an academic in London who teaches one of those stories at university. So
Oh, cool.
I suddenly had to go and talk to some students about a story that I last wrote, that I wrote like 15 years earlier. I was like, that wasn't something I was expecting when I wrote it. But
Yeah.
Uganda, I went to some library, a private library in London, and I got to go through microfilm and read the original report of the Uganda expedition.
That's
It
cool.
wasn't really Uganda, it was on the border in
Yeah.
Kenya somewhere. And I read through the original report and so on. So it had a long, just, a long period of coming in, becoming a book. So Circumference of the World is sort of the same thing. It was trying for quite a long time to write this book, but by the time it came out, it was a bit of a throwback to the stuff I used to do. And actually, the transition for me was writing a book called The Escapement, which is one of my favorite books.
Hmm.
And I was really searching for my way after A Man Lies Dreaming. I didn't know how I could do anything that was as good as that.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know if it was worth trying because, I wrote a book that I considered to be a great book. And at this point, where do you go?
Yeah.
Kind of like Roger Zelazny writing Lord of Light and then going, well, what do I do now? It's like,
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
still around. Do I just coast? Um, so I was casting around, and one of the nice things with doing the escape room was to move away from the stuff I was doing before and to write something that was very different and in a different style. And it starts using that idea of combining episodes, as it were, into a
Yeah.
narrative. And it doesn't have any of the politics in it, and it is a fantasy. And
Yeah.
it has that emotional core to it, and it's very weird. And I felt much better once I wrote that. Actually, I think after that, I went and wrote By Force Alone, which was, again, a very different sort of thing. So I kind of recovered myself after that, but it took a while.
Yeah, I can imagine like when you write something that's like this had to get out, now it's done. It's like where'd you go next? Um, but that's like an interesting point. That's like escapement not being a political. Looks like how many of your books are actually political? Like I've heard you say before that there's the problem that like a lot of science fiction fans don't like their books to be political, even though all art is political at its core. Um, how hard is it for you to write a book that doesn't have the political like politics sort of like in there? Because By Force Alone has politics in it, and
Oh yeah, By
The Hood
Force
does have
Alone
politics
does.
in it.
By Force Alone is just a takedown of nationalism, and
Yeah, I know.
but in a funny way, with magic.
Yeah.
um, yeah, I mean the escapement doesn't have. I think it's. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what people want necessarily, or even if I did know what they want, I don't think I'd be able to necessarily provide it. But
Yeah.
um, what the sense that I had, the reason I went and wrote Moror and Adama as straight novels, is my sense was people who want to read about complicated, political issues or historical processes don't want it to interrupt the, adventure quest stuff. And
Yeah.
the people who want to read about the political stuff don't want you to have, magical quests in the middle of it.
Yeah.
Or Unholy Land, which is a very good book about, Israel and Palestine and so on. It's got Lovecraftian jokes in it. I don't think people who want to read a serious book want a stupid Lovecraftian joke put in. So, in a way, it was easier to say, if you like this sort of stuff, this is
Mm.
that sort of book. And it worked in the sense that it does open up a completely different audience, completely different readership than you had before.
Yeah. That's an interesting thing. Like, do you sometimes feel that you're sort of like expected to talk about Israel Palestine stuff in your books simply by being from there? Because I re when Maror was translated into German, I listened to the interview you did with DLF, and like at the end of the interview, was like asking you about the current situation, and I'm like, is this something that we just like, or we need to ask anyone who has a connection to that place for their current position? Do you feel like tokenized in any way in that regard, or like expected to write about Jewish stuff and Israeli history?
No, because no one really cares what I do, so it's quite free. No, sadly, no one wants me to write about this stuff in particular. I mean, they'd like a nice space opera or something, which I think would be the next thing. So no, I don't feel under any obligation to do anything, and no one even question. I mean, I always think if you want to know what I think, read my books.
Yeah,
Read my books. I've spent a lot of effort and thousands of pages telling you what I think. So,
yeah.
you want to know, go and read it. I don't have anything to offer otherwise. I'm,
Yeah, yeah, I totally get that. But like, my point was more like, do you feel that it's important for you to put these things into books instead of just, writing a space opera about all aliens doing alien stuff or would that still kind of come through because of, who you are and your history of traveling throughout the world and so forth? Do you think that you could just go and
no,
write a non-political stuff about aliens flying through space and doing space opera things?
Well, I'm planning to do the alien thing, yeah. And I take great delight in writing something like the Judge D Vampire Mysteries,
Hmm.
No, I don't restrict myself to one thing, but ultimately, as a writer, you have to be honest in your writing and you have to
Yeah,
be true in your writing. And if I grew up in Detroit, I'd be writing about Detroit,
makes sense.
because that's what you know. So, you know you can try and push out of it. And I think with Six Lives is kind of what I was doing. I was
Hmm.
saying it was a bit Six Lives is a bit of a show off book in a sense of just saying, look what I can do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
makes sense.
I'm gonna do the other stuff now. I'm gonna do Peru. I'm gonna do Cairo. Um, so I enjoyed that.
Yeah,
And then, you get these reviews that say, oh, but this doesn't feel authentic enough because it doesn't write about. I don't know. It's,
yeah.
which I don't think you would necessarily level that criticism at someone else.
Yeah, that was kind of
Uh,
what I was like trying to get at. It's like that people expect you to do that, not necessarily that you want to. That like people expect you. And it's like he's the guy who does this thing, and then you don't do it. And like, well, it doesn't feel real because he doesn't do the thing that we expect him to do.
I think from a marketing's perspective, people would probably like you to just, if it's successful, they would like you to write the same book but slightly differently every time.
Yeah,
And a part of me wishes that I could. I mean, I wish I could be a detective novelist and write a series where it has the same detective book after book after book, and you
yeah,
do one book a year. That must be nice. That must be nice. But I
yeah.
can't. I'm not built to do it. I can only
Mhm.
write what catches me and what I'm interested in. And
Mhm.
um, yeah, yeah. And I still enjoy kind of doing the science fiction fantasy stuff as well. So.
Yeah.
And children's books, which are much, much harder to get into. Comics, which I wish I got to do more of. Um, and now I do, weird animated movies.
Oh yeah, I know, I know, I know.
So,
The I shared that
uh,
was like funny. I shared my the Loontown short film like with my sister, and she started looking and I was like, has he been to Tel Aviv? Because the opening sequence looks like Tel Aviv, and I'm like, you should check who wrote this.
no, it's actually Los Angeles,
It is
though.
Los Angeles.
Yeah,
Interesting.
it's filmed in Los Angeles in video. It's really interesting the way they filmed it.
Yeah,
The alleyway where you get the execution in the beginning of the film. It's a
yeah,
film about balloons, I should explain. So there's
yeah,
balloon execution and there's balloon sex, which was probably my favorite scene to, balloon sex. But the alleyway is actually the alleyway where they shot the famous fight scene from They Live, apparently,
okay.
with Roddy Piper. And then the ending is shot in the LA River. which again is, in
Yeah,
101 different movies.
yeah.
So yeah, it's all really interesting, famous locations in LA that it's
That's an
filmed in.
interesting one. How did you end up doing like animation films? How did that start?
Well, it's with my friend Near, who I collaborated with over the years, and we've written things together and
Yeah,
so on. And he's been into making film, and he lives in LA. And I think it started because he's a musician, so he started doing this weird animation for his his album. Um, don't tell him I hate his music. I tell him that it's okay.
yeah,
But and he was asking for my help in trying to come up with some sort of story structure for this thing. It's like an hour-long psychedelic animation thing.
okay,
And so at some point I got a bit annoyed and I said, if you could just like take whatever it is you're doing and we could actually have some characters and dialogue and keep it short, we could do something. So he was like, yeah, let's do that. And one of the reasons we ended up with balloons for Loontown was because he kept saying, "But I can't draw this, I can't draw that, I can't draw people, I can't draw." I
yeah,
said, "Well, what can you draw?" I'm like, "Can you draw a balloon? It's like a circle with a dangly bit."
yeah,
And he goes, "Yeah, I think I can do a balloon." I'm like, "Right, so they're balloons." It's a movie about balloons. But once you do that, the internal logic has to come into it. And so, that entire universe of balloons is consistently logical.
yeah. That's true.
And the terminology they use, the language they use is all consistent with them being balloons. So if you call a female balloon a skirt, it's very hard boiled, but it's also a terminology from hot air balloons.
That's true.
It's not, or hoppers, hoppers or gas
Yeah,
bags or whatever. So it was a lot of fun to do. It's one of my favorite things that I did.
yeah. I can
Obviously,
imagine
I
that.
only wrote it. I didn't have to do the hard work of actually, going out in LA and filming at night and
Yeah,
getting into the LA River. I don't know what they were up to,
yeah.
but yeah, I'm very happy with the way it came out.
Yeah, I can imagine like just playing around with the words, just like fun in that regard. So yeah, you're doing like you did the toasters on Mars stuff as well.
Yeah, yeah,
How do
yeah.
you
That
come?
that.
Yeah,
hmm.
how do you get there? Like, why toasters on Mars?
Well, that was the first thing we did actually. So that was very challenging to do because we were so restricted in what we could do.
Yeah.
And we also didn't really have the voice actors. We basically had two voice actors, so we could only write two characters.
Mm.
So my original concept was a bit more than that, and we really had to reduce it down based on what we could do. And it ended up sort of a waiting for Godot in a kitchen on Mars. Um, but as we went through it, we managed to push what we were doing and, add more action sequences to it, which really opened up the world. And then luckily got another voice actor to come in as well. And so it grew as we were making it. We're supposed to be working on quite an ambitious science fiction movie now,
Okay.
which I'm supposed to be writing. So we're
Oh,
trying to, now we know what we're doing a bit better, and we're trying to plan it all in advance so we don't have to sort of work it out as we go along.
mm. Like
But
how
yeah, we
much
keep
influence
making
has
little
movies
things.
have movies had on your writing in general, like on what you're doing in general?
Well, I think there's a huge cross pollination between film and novels that
Mm.
people don't often comment on, and it's as much as film and TV are inspired by books, they're inspiring books in their turn. So there's a
Mm.
dialogue that goes on. Especially with TV. If you think about the way TV is structured today, it's like a novel, really.
Yeah,
There's some very good television being made, and it's very novelistic in its approach. And at the
sure.
same time, I think writers have been borrowing or corresponding with cinematic techniques and so on. So I looked it up. There's not much that's been written about it academically, which I think is quite interesting because there is so much dialogue. And every, film people I talk to
Mm.
are always very knowledgeable about books. They're always readers. Um,
Yeah.
it's yeah.
That's interesting. It's like I obviously like I read a lot of Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett has a lot of like scenes that are very explicitly framed the way he does these kind of things. Are very explicitly framed as sort of like in a movie kind of style. The way he does like set up things he explains, and you're like, oh, this is like a film sequence you're writing at this point. It's like
But
interesting that
it's
no one writes
not at
about
the
that.
same time because, it would be very hard to actually adapt Terry Pratchett
Yeah,
into film, and you can see it from the adaptations they have made.
yeah,
There are varying, you know,
yeah. I know.
it's using this technique. I tell you, the one that I'm really happy that I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do
Mm.
was the bodies sequencing by force alone. I can't remember what it's called now. It's like where the bodies are buried, or I can't remember. And the whole idea was I really wanted to do the sequence from Goodfellas where they start finding the corpses everywhere.
Yeah,
When he starts killing everyone who was involved in the heist, and you
yeah,
find them all over the place. You find one in
yeah,
that dumpster, and it's all done with like this amazing soundtrack. And I was like, how do you do that in novelistic form?
yeah.
And somehow it worked. I mean, I really enjoyed putting
Mm,
that together. But even when I did it, I wasn't quite sure how I managed to do it. Um,
yeah,
or the Camelot sequence in By Force Alone was very much sort of,
yeah,
can I do the Great Gatsby? Buzz Lerman's The Great Gatsby specifically
yeah,
in novel form
yeah. Man, that makes
because
sense.
it's such a great film. Um, but yeah, it's sort of there's a cross pollination there, but they're very very different techniques.
Mm, yeah.
Very very different forms, and you're sort of adapting them or borrowing from them, but they're not really the same.
That makes sense. Stay for a moment with like the cinema thing. You have obviously one cinema episode in Six Lives, and I just read the new Silvia Moreno Garcia novel, The
Yeah.
Seventh Whale of Salome, and there are very similar, like there are parallels. And I know you're obviously friends with Sylvia. I was like, did you talk about that? Is there sort of like did those th parts sort of evolve sort of in parallel? Because well, obviously her book is about a Mexican character, and yours is about an Egyptian actress in that regard, a Coptic actress in that regard. It's like sort of like obviously the things they face, the struggles they face are similar, even though it's like, I don't know, 30, 40 years between them, sort of. Is there like a parallel there, or is that just like by accident?
No, no, you should totally blame Sylvia for that section.
Okay.
It's Although I didn't read Salome yet, but it was the last one, which was about
Oh, the silver
a
nitrate one.
lost movie, Silver Nitrates. It was a
Yeah.
really, really fun book, really good book. And I thought, yeah, I'll do a Sylvia Moreno Garcia section. I'll do this whole movie thing. She's obsessed with old movies, and I
Yeah.
find it quite entertaining. The same thing with the Ireland section. There wasn't going to be an Ireland section, but I
Okay.
happened to go to Ireland, and I thought, oh, this would be quite good. Can I put Ireland into this book? So
Yeah, that was
um,
like the general feel I got from Six Lives for me was like, well, he's here's Lavie doing his Agatha Christie section. Here's him doing his Silvia Morena Garcia section. The spy one felt very well, obviously it's a Cold War spy thriller section in general, but it also reminded me a lot of Tim Powers' Declare in a lot of ways because you know you have the whole like Kim Philby, well, totally not Kim Philby kind of character in there and stuff like that, and it's like interesting.
well, I'm a big Tim Powers fan, but I mean, I don't think that's what they do necessarily. These sections, I think they're sort of again into deconstruction of the genres that they supposedly operating
Yeah,
in.
exactly.
So the Country House Murder is a complete reversal of an Agatha Christie cozy. It's anything but cozy.
Yeah,
The spy thing, I really got interested in the idea of spy, um, the way spy novels work as opposed to the real world of spies. Because the real world of spies is really boring. That's the thing.
yeah,
And so the only way you can write spies is to mythologize them in the way John le Carre does or Mick Herron does, which
yeah,
is you create this mythology, which is part of the fun. It's almost like fantasy world building, really, the
yeah,
lamplighters and the slow horses and all the rest, all that terminology. But the real life of a spy is mostly done. And I was reading to research for this. I was reading a whole bunch of memoirs by Soviet spy masters and so on.
Yeah.
And and they're pretty downbeat about what they actually did. And they said the best assets you ever get are the ones who just walk in and offer their services. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the profile of your average sort of asset is, a divorced alcoholic with money troubles.
Yeah.
That's it. There's no, it's not Mission Impossible. It's pretty
Of course
dull. And
not.
so I wanted to write a very boring spy story, essentially, which was about how pointless most of it is. And
Well, that's
I
true.
think my favorite discovery was really running into this idea of Directorate 5 of the KGB,
Yeah.
which every residentura would have had one of those guys, and their job was to make up plans to what to do, how to blow up the Aswan Dam or how to assassinate the
Yeah.
president, just in case, just in
Yeah.
case.
Yeah.
So they just sit there kind of fantasizing the whole day about how they would do certain things. It's idiotic.
Yeah, but he's one of the funniest characters. He's constantly like, "What are you doing now?" And it's like he looks like a like a Dungeons and Dragons game master, just like writing down
Right.
battle maps. Like I can do this and this, and it's like,
No, exactly. And I mean, a lot of it is just accidental and petty and,
yeah,
day to day. And real spies, yeah, I mean, you get spies who are, assets, people who actually betray their country for money or whatever it is, who take
yeah,
them. But the agents, the people who run them, they're career officers, and the worst thing that's going to happen to most of them is they'll get deported
yeah,
back to back home. So that's I wanted to kind of play with those different genres and expectations.
yeah,
And periods. I don't know. It was, again, it was something I haven't really done this before, so I just wanted to see if I could do it, and I wanted to see how it would turn out.
yeah.
So the whole thing was an experiment.
It's an
Um,
interesting question. Like, how much research do you actually do? Obviously, for like Maror and Adama, you did like a lot of research. I'm still waiting for the whole crimes involving monkeys thing.
oh yeah, there's a mention of it in the new book that I'm trying to finish.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's like, how
I'm
much
just
research do you do for your books? You already talked about like getting to look at the microfilms from the African expedition, and it's like, how much research do you do for your books?
yeah. Well, I'm lazy. That's the truth. I don't really want to go off and do research. Um, you try and fake it to a certain extent. I think by force alone is where I really fake it because I've seen a lot of reviews saying, wow, this guy really obviously read his, original, you know, King Arthur in the original Arthuriano or whatever. And I'm like, no, I'm just faking it. I'm just taking as much as I need from places. But no,
Yeah,
I do research fairly heavily. Moreau is obviously very research
yeah,
heavy,
yeah, for sure.
and that relied on a lot of archive research, newspaper archives. I had a retired crime reporter who was helping me along with it as well, kind of pointing me in all kinds of interesting directions to
Yeah.
go sniff. So I researched as much as I can. What I just discovered, I'm editing the third Moreau book at the moment.
Mm.
And I got to a section and I started slowing down. It wasn't reading very well. And I realized I was doing that classic mistake, which is I was trying to show off my research,
Oh, yeah, yeah,
which is a terrible thing that writers do. Is I spend so much time researching this that I want to show it off, and it's boring. It doesn't matter. So I had to basically go cut, 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 cut. Which is something you do before the book goes to
yeah,
print. So you want the book to actually read. Okay, but yeah, most of the research never shows up
yeah.
because it's boring and it's unnecessary. You just want to show that 5% of research that suggests you've done the other 95% of the research.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. But I was just like, because like even for the science fiction novels or the weirder novels, like how much research did actually go into something like A Man Lies Dreaming?
Yeah, again, a fair amount. But then, one of the hacks is live, either travel or live somewhere where you can draw on your own experience. So
Yeah,
writing A Man Lies Dreaming set in London makes it a bit
helped.
easier. I get things wrong all the time.
Yeah,
And the only people who ever pick up on it are usually the translators. And they are
yeah,
the most irritating people in the world, translators, because because they pick up, they actually do their due diligence. And it turns out, I'll tell you, I mean, I'm not proud of this, but the quotes that open A Man Likes Dreaming are both wrong, as it turns out. They're both misattributed. And the only person to ever pick up on it was the Spanish translator. And so if you pick up the Spanish edition, it's got the correct attributions in the book. But my attitude at that point was, but my attributions are better. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Um, and again, I think The Violent Century, when it came out in Poland, the translation editor used to be a guide in Auschwitz.
Oh,
And
okay.
so she pointed out that I got the color of the bricks wrong,
All right.
which, I
That's
mean, what are you supposed to do? Yeah,
yeah.
so that's been changed for the Polish edition. So occasionally you'll get these editions
Mm.
that are the only true editions. But generally, once I've finished with the book, you have to accept a certain level that you're not going to get everything right.
Yeah, of course.
You, tr- you do your best.
Like, do you feel
Um,
like pressure to do like more research for something like Maror than you did for, I don't know, uh, for like one of the more science fiction-y kind of books? Or is there like, so like I can write about Arthurian literature without doing like much research because,
no, but I had to do a lot of research. In fact, the reason I wrote By Force Alone is because I had to teach King Arthur. I
that
got
sounds
roped into
terrible.
teaching. I got roped into teaching a British fantasy fiction course for undergraduate students.
Yeah.
And the guy who set up the course was a medievalist, so he was teaching them Gawain and the Green Knight in the original Anglo-Saxon, I
Yeah.
think. It was something about the color scheme in Gawain and the Green Knight in Anglo-Saxon.
Mm.
And I was like, I know nothing about King Arthur. And I have to teach it. So I had to cram, just to put together a 1 hour lecture to introduce the topic. And I
Yeah.
got fascinated by it as I was researching
Yeah.
because I realized the whole thing was basically sort of like an early shared world fan fiction universe, that it was a lot of different people at different times adding bits to it.
Yeah, and always adapting into
Um,
whatever they kind of are concerned with whenever they're writing, which is like, like so much like Victorian propaganda kind of goes into like the 19th century author that everyone sort of like takes afterwards in a lot of ways.
No, but even
Yeah,
before, way before the Victorians, the people who were writing this, the whole story starts with Geoffrey of Monmouth, and
exactly.
he just gives you the basic structure.
Yeah,
And then someone comes along and he says, "What if we had a guy called Lancelot?" And everyone goes, "Yeah, that sounds great." And
yeah,
someone says, "What about a place called Camelot?" And they go, "Yeah, great." And someone else,
yeah,
someone says, "What about if we have a Grail?" They're like, "A Grail? Tell me about that. That sounds fun." And he's like, well, what if there's this guy who drinks a saucer of blood every night so he can stay immortal? And they're like, this is great. And
yeah,
that's the first incarnation of the Grail, I think, is that weird vampire thing.
yeah, yeah,
So by Force Alone has all three versions of the Grail because I
yeah. I know.
couldn't help myself.
Yeah, what I found
Uh,
interesting is like that, like later, like the 16th or 17th century, at some point, like the Scottish succession was like sort of like based on the idea that actually Mordred is, that the Scottish succession is like superior to the British, like the English succession, because Mordred being a son of Arthur and so forth. And they're like, you're using fantasy stories that kind of accreted of like the last
oh
500
yeah,
years to do
and
actual politics.
in fact, the iconography
Mhm.
to this day is used by white supremacist groups in the UK.
Yeah,
You have, Pendragon and
yeah,
none of it makes any sense because Arthur isn't even, he's a Celt essentially, and he's fighting the Anglo-Saxons,
yeah,
and he loses, and the Anglo-Saxons come in, and so
yeah,
that's why it was interesting to do the Hood as well because that's about when the Normans come in and they kick
yeah.
the hell out of the Anglo-Saxons, and it's like, how is this your national myth? It makes no sense.
I mean,
So I find that interesting. And also, the one people that you can always make fun of without having serious consequences is the British.
maybe
So
that's the
I do
price you
enjoy
pay
that.
for like centuries of imperialism, that once it's gone, you get to made fun of by everyone else.
Yeah, you've earned it a bit, haven't you?
I
You've
mean,
earned it.
as a German, I would not say anything about that.
Well, again, it's fun to make fun of Germans.
Exactly.
What can I say?
It's well deserved.
And you can't argue against it. So,
That also
but it's
helps, yeah.
about you do have to pick your targets, don't you? There's no you want to make fun of the people who deserve to be made fun of.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's true.
I try, I try, but
Yeah,
yeah, no, I'm finishing the third Maror book,
nice.
which hopefully I can hand in this week.
And that one's going to be
Um,
like more about the Ottoman time, or
it goes back to the Ottomans and then the British Mandate. So, yeah,
okay.
that's been kind of interesting to research as well.
Did
In
you set
fact, I'm
Ottoman?
mostly
Yeah,
researching Thomas Cook and Son. It turns
interesting.
out that, the 19th century, the Brits were just like they are today. They would go on package holidays with Thomas Cook.
Yeah,
And
he certainly
so,
invented that.
yeah, so you just go on this whole 10-day excursion to the Holy Land, see the sights, have the porters make you, you know, cutlets for breakfast and scrambled eggs, and then you take off to the Nile or Istanbul or
Which
wherever
is
the
not too
fancy
different from
takes
like
you.
the Templar package you could get like in the 13th and 14th century when you pay the Templars to bring you there and take you back again.
Oh, so but it would have taken you a bit longer though.
It would have taken you a bit longer, but the package deal was kind of the same.
I
That's
mean,
interesting.
yeah, it would be
Um,
interesting to find out how far back the package holidays go.
I
Like
wouldn't know, but
Egyptian Empire time.
I'm pretty sure
Come
you
see
could
the
book.
pyramids. We're still building them, but you can take a look.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
Yeah,
and
this will be the Great Wall of Uruk.
it'd be
Um,
fun.
like, did you originally imagine that the Maror part as a trilogy, or is that something that kind of came about over time?
I can't remember, to be honest. That's a good question. I think there was the idea that it felt natural, but I can't quite remember how it came about.
Yeah, okay.
To be honest, I mean, a lot of it was bound up with the pandemic as well, so your memory does tend to be fogged by a lot of it.
Yeah, yeah.
I think the intention was there. I mean, and in a way, I think Adama might even be a better book,
It
but it
feels
was,
tighter to me, and it feels more focused. Maybe because you have like the focusing it on that one kibbutz and that one basically extended family in a lot of ways, which it felt more personal, like from,
it's,
the things you said about your personal history from time to time. I was like, this feels like much more personal.
but it was very hard to tell because, it was outside of my comfort zone a little bit.
Hmm.
And I just remember reading through it before sending it off and having no idea if it was any good or not. And I was sort of, it felt like a slog just to get through it. And then it kind of was, it went off to the publisher and I was like, I really don't know about this book. And then, it came out. And then I thought, you know what, I've got a feeling this is quite good. But it took me a while to come to that conclusion.
Yeah.
Because you're trying to do something different with every book and you're trying to be ambitious with every book and you can always fail with them because you're
Hmm.
trying to do something. So it's hard to sort of gauge sometimes,
Yeah.
especially when you've written it. So again, with the new one, I'm reading through it. I have no idea if it's any good. I mean,
Like to stay with that for a moment, like so you've sort of like extended your reach from like science fiction, fantasy, comic books, animated movies about balloons into serious literary fiction. Is there a way that you are treated differently by the people that do literary fiction stuff? Obviously, you already mentioned that it's not actually selling that well because, literary fiction is made for people that want to talk about literature, not necessarily buy a lot of books. I feel like fantasy is probably selling much better. Um, at, in some regards, like, is there a way that people treat you differently when you write, when you talk about Maror or Adama or Six Lives compared to when you talk about something like Escapement or like A Man That's Dreaming or even Neon.
no, I think for sure. I mean, firstly, I can never talk about the escapement without people looking at me like I've, killed a cat or something. I'm like, it's a book about clowns. You should read it. It's a great book about clowns. It's a Western with clowns. Um, it's
It
like the
feels
kiss of
like
death.
someone was making fun of Stephen King by writing a book about clowns in the West.
Yeah, just because Stephen King wrote a fantasy western doesn't mean that all fantasy westerns,
And he wrote he
emanate
wrote the
from. And I
definitive
enjoyed.
horror clown,
I like the dark. What's it called? The Dark Tower. I
Dark
enjoy
Tower.
the original. I think the original short stories that
Yeah,
formed the Gunslinger, that were
yeah,
published in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. I think
yeah,
they're really good. But at the same time, there's such a long tradition of weird westerns
yeah,
that I really don't necessarily think there's a need to go. And we had this with the Washington Post column because me and Sylvia were writing the Washington Post column
yeah,
for 3 years, and every time we picked a subject to write about, we always wanted to promote unknown books, less known books, international writers, and so
yeah.
on. But every topic we picked up happens to have a Stephen King book
Well, the man's been
already
writing for
set
like
in
50
it.
years.
Yeah, but they would always ask us to lead with that. So we'd always have to open with, well, Stephen King wrote a book about telepathic cats from Mars who kill people. Here are five other books about telepathic cats from Mars who kill people,
Yeah.
and it's not
In
it's not
I feel like
necessarily.
Stephen King is like The Simpsons in that regard. Like Simpsons have always done it before. It's like Stephen King has written a book on that, and you
He's
know,
written a lot of books, and I mean, like I said, I do love the original Gunslinger stories,
yeah, The Gunslinger is pretty good.
but I just wouldn't necessarily recognize it as an influence on the escapement, but it's possible.
I
Um,
wasn't suggesting it was like an influence. It was more like this is probably like how it gets marketed and how people think about it afterwards. Because
yeah, you get a lot of the references to the Dark Tower, which I'm like, well, there's no clowns in the Dark Tower, but again, he's done a book about clowns,
exactly.
even so you can't win. It's
No,
sort of like,
you can't win against Stephen King. I always go like, well,
uh,
if you liked it, you can go and read something wicked by Ray Bradbury, which is basically the same thing but
yeah.
better.
I have this memory. I did when I won the World Fantasy Award back in the day. It was
Yeah.
up against Stephen King and George R. R. Martin. Um, and they're like, "Oh no, that I won and they lost." And then I get on the flight back to the UK, and the person next to me is reading Stephen King. So I'm like, I don't think Stephen King is that bothered, you know, when he's
Yeah. Yeah, I guess
opening
you,
the shower when the money comes pouring down. I think he's all right. I think he's all right.
yeah,
Um,
probably.
I forgot what the question
The
was.
question was more like how people treat you differently when you are in
Oh
literary
yeah.
fiction mode.
No, they definitely do. I mean, look at Germany. That's a case in point. With Moreau coming out in Germany, the exposure is unbelievable. I mean, I've
Yeah.
never experienced anything like it. I mean,
It made me feel really
I
smug when I saw it. It's like, well, I've been reading this for like the last years.
I had a guy from Der Spiegel fly over to London just to interview me.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
read
I've
that.
never had someone fly somewhere to interview me. And Der Spiegel is, a huge,
Yeah,
huge newspaper
I know.
magazine. I mean, so for me, I was like, what? What's happening?
It was so funny. I was talking to someone like recently. He's like, "What are you doing?" It's like, I'm gonna talk to Lavie Tidhar." And it's like, "Should I know?" And there's like, "Well, the last two German magazines that interviewed him were like this Der Spiegel and DLF." And it's like, "Wow, you're like a real journalist now." And I'm like, "No, I'm not." But
No, it was very strange, but you do get them. I got in the UK, for example,
mm,
Moreau and Adama got reviewed in the TLS,
mm,
which you would just not get if you were writing, your little genre books or
yeah,
whatever. So you do get that. At the same time, like Six Lives just came out and no one's reviewed it at all. It doesn't seem to exist. Maybe
interesting.
it's just not very good. I have no idea. But yeah, you can never tell. And also sometimes people would get in touch with me and you think they found me because of the literary stuff, and then they go, "Oh, I love Central Station." It's like, okay, not what I was expecting. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, I don't know. I'm not, I don't make myself super available because I mean, if you liked it, great. If you didn't like it, okay. Like that's
yeah.
fine. I don't need any ego boosting or
How much
uh,
ego do you actually need to write books, though? I mean, just like as general questions, do you need to be very convinced of your like brilliance to even hand in like a manuscript to an editor, or do you think that's just like,
I think it's a mixture of having a giant ego and severe self-doubt. I think you kind of need to operate on the margins. So,
Mm.
I have a very healthy opinion of what I do. I think it comes across on Twitter quite a bit, doesn't it? And, I mean, I'm not shy, but at the same time, I respect the fact that a lot of people won't like it,
Mm.
won't think highly of it, and it doesn't bother me that
Yeah.
much.
The Twitter thing is like an
Um,
important question. Like, when did you first read the Moomins? Because I I wrote your Moomin hard-boiled fan fiction that is sort of like the same opening as A Man Lies Dreaming. And I'm like, and you have a Moomin reference in Circumference of the World. And I'm like, how
yeah,
did the
I love
Moomins
the
made it into your world?
I love the Moomins. I mean, I read a lot of children's books in translation when I was growing up.
Mhm.
So we had all the European classics. Michael Ende or Michael Ende,
Yeah,
I'm a huge fan of. And I went to Bavaria a few years ago, and I insisted on going to the town he was born, where there's a Michael Ende Park.
yeah.
And no one could understand why I drank this place. But I'm like, you don't understand. But this is the amphitheater from Momo. This is very
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
So, I grew up on a lot of sort of European translated fiction. And I mean, I think the Moomins are still as brilliant as ever. If you read, the winter one,
Yeah,
which I've read,
Moomin. I have no idea what it's
Wonderland.
called, but I know which one.
Yeah, and it's an absolutely astonishing book,
Yeah.
and I love children's books. I love picture books. I love illustrated books, and I think some of the greatest art that actually has come out in recent years is in that space, is in sort of children's picture books, which again don't get the respect that they perhaps should.
Yeah, I mean, you just did
They
like a
don't get.
children's book, or
Yeah, I mean, mine is probably not, you know, not the movements. But no, it's a field I really enjoy and I really want to do more in, and it's a very hard field to actually work in.
how
It's
hard
very
was it to
hard
switch
to.
like brain space to go into like the children's book part though?
I don't know because I think Candy, especially in the original manuscript version,
Yeah.
Candy's pretty much a man lies dreaming without Adolf Hitler in it.
Yeah.
That's all it is. It still deals with the same. It deals with the same themes, the same ideas.
Yeah.
It's still about power and about corruption and so on, just for kids. Book of the Future is pretty much Central Station for kids. I mean, occasionally I mess up. I wrote another children's book after Candy, and
Mm.
unfortunately, it was kind of set in a world where there was a global pandemic. It was a really fun book about a pandemic,
Whoops.
but it went on submission 2 weeks before the pandemic actually hit. And
That's bad timing.
you've never seen a book rejected so quickly by so many publishers. So, and it's a really fun book. Um, so I'm still hoping if people forget about COVID one day, it might come out.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a difficult field, It's comics is another one that's really difficult. I really enjoyed writing Adler,
Yeah.
which and it looks great, but it's really hard to go and do another one.
How's writing comics different? Like how do you do that like in a different way from writing a novel though? It's like obviously because you have to work with like artists and stuff. Do you?
Yeah, it's very different. To be honest, I don't really enjoy any other writing. I mean, I enjoy writing fiction.
Mm.
Every other form of writing is a lot more work, you know.
Yeah.
Comics is a very different medium. Scripts are very different medium.
Yeah.
And yeah, you struggle a lot more with doing them. Comics you're writing visually. I'm basically writing for an artist, and a lot of
Yeah.
the time, because I mean, I've written a few that haven't been made, but I'd be writing it to the artist. So I'd be like, and here, if you fancy it, I think this would be cool if you do that.
Yeah.
So I'm really addressing it to a collaborator, and I enjoy collaborating with people.
Yeah.
Not on fiction, but things like Children's Book of the Future. I worked with my friend Richard, who's a futurologist or futurist. I think
Yeah.
it's a futurist. And that was a lot of fun putting this book together. And then again, we get this artist, Cynthia, who
Yeah.
did all the art, who makes the book come alive, really. So you wouldn't have a book without these three people working together, as it were.
Yeah.
Um, And again, if you're making an animated film, you're just writing the story, and you're not really doing any of the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
not. You don't have to go and then make it. And I always say I just like to claim all the credit without doing any of the work.
Yeah. So basically, at the end of the day, you're just like you're trying to do the easy work and then get all the credit afterwards, right?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't feel easy when you're writing it,
And
I
of course not.
suppose, but it's still much easier to do than going and spending hours and hours and hours. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. I'm too late. It's again, it's the same with filmmaking.
Yeah.
I was talking to a friend of mine who's a producer, and I just remember this quite vividly. And they were filming some monster movie in Ireland in winter, and she had to get up at 6 in the morning and like freezing cold to go and film this. And I was like, why? Why would anyone put themselves through this?
Yeah.
I would not. It does not sound. I could never be like a director or something.
No.
Plus, you have to interact with people, which
Yeah.
is against anything writers want to do usually.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're now just editing, finishing the editing for the Maror trilogy, and do you have like plans beyond that already? Because you know, a year without at least like two Tidhar novels sounds like weird, and I'm like, what's your next plans? Do you already have plans, or is it more like you'll see what happens after you polish that one off and sort of like have to figure out where to go next after doing the historically sort of like accurate literary fiction, or do you already know where to go next?
Yeah, it's tricky. It is. It does feel like another transitional period at the moment.
Mm,
So definitely the third Moral book is going to come out next year,
yeah.
and I'm doing a couple of short story collections actually,
Okay.
mostly for fun more than anything else. But I'm doing a crime collection, and I'm doing a sort of horror and dark fantasy collection. Because it's two things that you wouldn't really expect. You would expect a science fiction collection or something, but I
I
thought
was
that'd be
always
more
expecting a
fun.
crime collection from you, but you know,
Yeah, I haven't written that much crime, but I think the stuff I've done is, fairly
mm,
good. It will make a nice collection. So that's all I've really, yeah, it feels a bit transitional at the moment. So I have plenty of ideas of what I want to do,
mm.
but we'll have to see. And saying that, I better get back to editing this book, or I'm already behind. That's the problem. I'm already
Yeah.
behind on it. It should have really been with them by now. So I don't want to get into trouble.
Now we don't want that. Yeah, well, with that, I guess we've reached a natural end point. So thank you very much for actually taking the time off editing. I hope you don't get into trouble for those 90 minutes or whatever we had not editing. Um, yeah, thank you very much. And
Well,
everyone else, I don't know, go read some books by Lavie Tidhar.
yeah, go read some books about clowns and
Yes, go read a
stuff.
book about clowns.
And no, thanks for having me.
Thank you very, very much.